Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is the Microsoft Graph community call for May of 2021. Today, we've got some great content. We'll be going through app consent deep dive, as well as a little bit about considerations for creating online meetings within Microsoft Graph. Today, we have Philippe and Fabian who'll be joining us to do the presentations. So there is our agenda. Quick note, if anyone is interested in presenting in the future, we do accept community contributions. So welcome anyone who wants to share information about solutions you've built or potential different topics related to Microsoft Graph. If you are interested, feel free to reach out to myself or Jeremy, brian.jackett@microsoft.com or jeremy.fake@microsoft.com. Feel free to include the information down at the bottom on here, things like the solution or topic area, some of the APIs you might be using, or any other platforms or services that you're using in your solution. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Philippe to talk us through the app consent deep dive.
Sounds good. My name's Philippe. I'm a program manager in the identity team at Microsoft. So today I want to talk a little bit about API permissions and consent, in particular when it comes for permissions and consent for access to Microsoft Graph. And rather than do what we've done other times, which is sort of just show you how you use MCell or the Graph SDK to request the token and get access, I wanted to take it maybe a step back and sort of talk about some more general concepts around authorization for applications, accessing APIs in general, and specifically Microsoft Graph. So some of the topics that we're going to cover today is basically just in general how apps and services can access Microsoft Graph, which will lead us to two of these authorization flavors, which is application permissions and delegated permissions. We'll go over the concepts, some of the ways in which permissions can be requested. We'll go over some of the ways in which permissions can be granted. And then I think most importantly, we'll talk about sort of some of the aspects regarding to how much data these permissions grant access to and what alternatives we have for restricting the set of data the permissions give access to. So just to very, very broadly, whenever an app or a service needs to access data, let's just say in general through an API, there are two ways in which this data can be accessed, two ways in which the Microsoft Identity Platform explicitly supports. One of them is what we call direct access. The application is not, there's no user involved. The application is just directly going to try to perform an action, read data, download a file, create a file, update a user, reset a password, etc. That's one flavor, direct access. The second flavor is, and indirect access, the API, so Microsoft Graph, if you're calling Microsoft Graph, is going to ask just one question in terms of authorization. And the question is this app authorized? So the caller is an app. The word we use often is the subject of the token. The subject of the request is an app. And the question is the subject authorized? Is the app authorized? The other form is when the application is not doing what we call direct access, it's actually accessing on behalf of a user. We also call this sometimes delegated access or app plus user access. And that's why in this diagram, there's a user and an application on the left. And then the API is on the right, and the little token, if you notice, the pentagon in the middle is the user, right? Because the thing that's identified that's making this request is the user. And so the first question is not is the app authorized. The first user is actually is the user authorized. And so that first question on both sides is actually the same question. It's is the subject authorized? It just turns out that on the left, the subject is the application, or technically the application service principal. And on the right, it's the user. So ultimately, the question is the thing or person that's identified in this API request, are they authorized to take this action? That's the first question. Now, when an application is accessing on behalf of a user, the application is not allowed to do anything it wants on behalf of the user. The application will be restricted and limited, or scoped is another term we use, to what it can do on behalf of the user. So there's a second question in terms of authorization, that the API will ask. Is the app allowed to do this on behalf of this user, right? And so when it's access on behalf of a user, there are two questions that need to be answered. Is the user authorized to take the action? And then is the app allowed to do it on behalf of the user? One way in which we often speak about the access on behalf of a user case is via intersection. If you imagine a list of everything that a user is allowed to do, all the actions, read files or read this one file, list all users, etc., all the actions the user could do, and then you have a list of all the things that the application is allowed to do on behalf of that user. Then you intersect the two. That's what the application will also actually be able to do. The application won't be able to do something that the user themselves is not allowed to do, which is one of the big benefits of this form, because there's no risk of the application accidentally allowing the user to do something the user shouldn't have been able to do. And the user won't be able to use the application to do something that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to. For these two forms of access, we have two types of permissions. So when we're talking about permissions for access on behalf of a user, we have something we call delegated permissions. And these delegated permissions are used for answering that second question. It's for representing what an application is allowed to do on behalf of a user. And so when we say an application has the delegated permission user.read.all, we're not saying the application can read all users. We're saying the application can read all users on behalf of a user. And so whether or not the application will actually be able to read all users depends on whether the signed in user is allowed to read all users. And so if the signed in user, for example, is a guest user who's not by default allowed to read all users, that won't work. But if the signed in user is a regular member user, then yes, they'll be able to list all users. For direct access, one form we have for granting the permission to access data directly in Microsoft Graph is what we call application permissions. We also call them app roles. App roles is actually the more general term. There are two flavors of app role, or actually, technically speaking, there's one flavor of app role that can be configured to be an app role that can be given to a user. We don't use those for Microsoft Graph. But we can also have app roles that can be granted to applications or to application service principals. And the app roles that are configured so that they can be assigned to other applications, that's what we call application permissions. But really, they're just app roles. And so every API that's registered in the Microsoft Identity Platform, including Microsoft Graph, can define a list of application permissions or a list of app roles, and they can define a list of delegated permissions. And so Microsoft, as the publisher of the Microsoft Graph application, we've defined a list of application permission, a pretty long list, and a list of delegated permissions. One thing to keep in mind is that it is, especially for direct access, application permissions are not the only way to authorize an application to access data through Microsoft Graph or through other APIs. And one good example of an API that doesn't rely on application permissions for authorization for direct access would be Azure. So if anybody's familiar with the Azure Management API, there are no application permissions. Instead, directly in Azure, an application or a service principal that represents an application can be granted a role in an Azure subscription and can be given access to data directly like that. That application is still going to use Microsoft Identity Platform to get a token, for example, to Azure, but that token won't identify any application permissions. It'll say, look, I don't know what they have access to, but this is who they are. And then it is the resource, the API, in this example, Azure, the Azure Management API, that's going to look and see, okay, do they have access? The same applies for Microsoft Graph, except Microsoft Graph also has application permissions. So it is possible, and in some cases explicitly supported, for applications to be granted other forms of permission to access data. For example, an application, or whenever I say an application in terms of authorization, I'm actually saying the service principal for an application within a customer's tenant can be made owner of a group. And when a service principal is owner of a group, what that means is that that application that is represented by that service principal, it has all privileges that an owner would normally have over a group. So that means it can add users, add members, remove members, change the display name, add other owners, etc. So that's one example of how an application can be given direct access to a group is by making the owner of the group. And so that application that was made owner of the group could just go get an access token from Microsoft Graph and make API calls to manage that group, and that will work. Likewise, A service principal can be assigned a directory role. It's possible to take, let's say, the application administrator directory role, assign it to a service principal, and let's make it even fancier. Let's assign it to a service principal, but scoped only to one other service principal. So we've taken a service principal representing your application. We've given it the role application administrator, but only over one other service principal. And so by that point, that application will be able to get a token, call graph, and make use of that. So it's a really important point to call out is that not all forms of authorization are necessarily going to be application permissions and delegated permissions. It's also possible for apps to be authorized in other ways. But going back to these two forms, one thing that's particular about these two types of permissions, application permissions and delegated permissions, is that they can be requested. And there's this experience that we call consent, where the application developer, the application publisher requests permissions, and then the customer that's trying to use that application has an opportunity to grant those permissions. And then Microsoft Identity Platform is sitting in the middle, helping orchestrate this negotiation, let's say. Right. So one way in which an application can request permissions for Microsoft Graph is during sign-in, right? So during sign-in, using, of course, a library like MCell, an application can dynamically request permissions, in this case, delegated permissions. Now, we know it's delegated permissions because it's a during sign-in. So if it's during sign-in, it means there's a user involved. And so necessarily, we're talking about those permissions that are on behalf of the user. An application can dynamically request a list of permissions. In this example, user read and user read basic all. Now, if these permissions are granted, let's assume the user is allowed to consent, they consent. Those permissions would be granted in addition to anything that was granted previously. And we call this incremental consent, right? The idea being that little by little, as the user starts using the application and using new features and new functionality or additional functionality, only once they start using that additional functionality, then does an application actually request the access. That ensures that the user has an opportunity to start exploring the application before having to give the application more permissions. This form of requesting permissions only works for delegated permissions. You can't dynamically request application permissions today. The other way to do this, it's also as part of sign-in, is what we call static consent, or requesting whatever permissions have been configured. So here, instead of requesting any list of permissions, we're just saying .default, or technically, because if omitted, we assume it's Microsoft Graph, this would be https graph.microsoft.com/.default. And what that means is the application is trying to get access to Microsoft Graph, but it's not stating what permissions. It's basically saying, give me whatever I have access to, and if I don't have access to, go to the list that I configured on the app registration. If these permissions are granted in this case, this will actually revoke anything that was granted previously. This does allow configuring both application permissions and delegated permissions. So when it comes to granting the permission, so we talked about direct access, access on behalf of a user. For direct access, we have application permissions. For access on behalf of a user, we have delegated permissions. We talked about how during sign-in or through the configuration, you can configure your client application to request permissions. And then when it comes to granting permissions, one way to grant permissions is through the consent experience. So when an app requests access, the user that's signing into the app might be prompted for consent. And it's very important, and this is an example of a consent screen for the Microsoft Graph Explorer application, trying to get access to Graph, right? In this example, the user here was allowed to consent to these permissions, and they actually have the option to accept. But it's very possible that a user signing into an application will actually not be allowed to. Every customer can configure when users are allowed to consent and which users are allowed to consent for applications. And customers can take into account publisher verification. So in this example here, it is the app does come from a verified publisher. They can take into account, customers can choose permission classifications and say, look, I'll only allow users to consent to permissions from verified publishers, and only if they're one of these permissions that I've classified low. And then there are other conditions, such as where the app was registered, maybe an individual trusted app publisher, etc. So there's lots of variables, And as an app developer, you should never assume that users will be able to consent to your application. In addition to the customer settings, Microsoft will step in and in certain situations just say, you know what, even if the user would be allowed to consent, we're not completely sure about this app, and so we're just going to disallow user consent and make sure that we go get an admin in front of this to take another look at this application. Now, when a user isn't allowed to consent for themselves, if they're not necessarily blocked completely, or at least not forever, using a feature called the admin consent workflow or admin consent request workflow, instead of saying, sorry, go away, we have this screen here, which is the user is offered the opportunity to request access. And so in this example, if the app was requesting access to all users' profiles, which is a permission this user wasn't allowed to consent on their own, they could fill out this information, request access, that would go to a queue, people would get notified, and the admins will then have an opportunity to review that and decide whether they're comfortable with this access to their organization's data or not. Now, consent is one way, and what we actually walk through here is what we call user consent, where a user's consenting for delegated permissions on behalf of themselves. There are a few other flavors or forms of granting these two permissions that we've talked about. The first one is admin consent or tenant-wide admin consent. As the name suggests, this is something that is a very privileged operation that normally an administrator would do. By default, global administrator, in some cases, application administrator can do. Right? This is for granting tenant-wide consent. So we're not saying this application, you can do these permissions on behalf of this one user. We're actually saying on behalf of all users. So any other user in the organization who signs into that same application, they will not be prompted for consent for that permission, and they won't be blocked either. And it also works for app-only permissions. Otherwise, because users cannot grant app-only permissions on their own, because app-only permissions give access to data for the whole organization. Admin consent can be triggered by the application by redirecting the user off to a special URL. It can be done from the Azure portal, from the admin consent request queue, or just from under the apps listed in enterprise apps. And some customers have taken to constructing the admin consent URL themselves. There's lots of forms of this. This works for both. There's a flavor for dynamic and for static. In this example here, we've an example of admin consent using the static approach, where it's just for whatever's configured. Then in addition to that, customers can use Microsoft Graph to grant permissions. So application permissions, as I mentioned, are actually app roles. And so to grant an application permission, you create an app role assignment. Delegated permissions in Microsoft Graph are represented as something we call OAuth2 permissions or OAuth2 permission scopes. And to grant them, what you create is an OAuth2 permission grant. And an app role is very simple. It identifies the API, it identifies the client app service principal, and it identifies which app role, so which application permission. And delegated permission is basically the same. There's the client application, the API, the permission, or actually the list of delegated permissions. But there's an extra thing, which is on behalf of whom? On behalf of one user or on behalf of all users. So both of those can be done with Microsoft Graph. Now, in terms of the scope of data that Microsoft Graph allows access to, one thing to keep in mind is that Microsoft Graph permissions, most of them, actually allow access to a lot of data. Almost every application permission is what we call tenant-wide, right? All files in the entire organization, the files.read.all permission. Delegated permissions are restricted to what the user can access, but within the scope of what the user can access, it's any file in the organization that the signed-in user can access. Many users can access a lot of files, and some of them might be quite sensitive. And it might be that the application really only needs access to some of them. Other permissions do actually limit which resources can be accessed. So for example, the user.read permission only allows reading one user profile, and that's the user profile of the signed-in user. Mail.read, likewise, only allows accessing one mailbox, which is the mailbox for the signed-in user. So these are examples of delegated permissions that do restrict the set of resources, but it's important to keep in mind that that's why many of the other permissions end in .all, because it's for a lot of things. Now, even delegated permissions, though, can also be very broad or very sensitive. For example, and what ends up becoming most important there is who is signing in. If an administrator signs in and an application has been granted the delegated permission to take administrative actions, and you have an admin, well, you can do anything you want, basically, at that point. If the CEO of the company or some other user with access to highly sensitive data signs in, the application might have access to that data. So that's something to keep in mind, and a very good reason to make sure you're only asking for access your application really needs. There are some capabilities available today, and more coming soon, to restrict the set of resources that an app can access. So for mail, calendar, and contacts, so things in Exchange Online, we have something today called Exchange App Access Policies that can allow limiting the set of mailboxes the app has access to, the set of calendars, the set of user mailboxes, etc. So, and the way this works is basically the customer grants admin consent to the application permission, so read all mailboxes, for example, and then creates the app access policy to restrict that down to only these mailboxes or exclude these mailboxes. There's a limit today in the number of policies that can be created in one tenant, in one organization. So that's one of the limitations today. As I mentioned, we're working on some changes in this area coming up. Teams, channels, and conversations, and what we're working on is in general for ways to restrict access. For teams, channels, and conversations, a team owner, so this is in Microsoft Teams, a team owner can consent when installing a Teams app to only give the app access to that team. So instead of saying, hey, I'd like to see the channel messages for every single team in the organization, a team owner can allow an app to only have access to that one team's channel messages. Today, this capability, which is called Teams Resource Specific Consent, or Teams RSC, doesn't yet support access for files and calendar, but that's something that we do have on our roadmap to support access for other resources that are part of a team. And this is a very important distinction because other permissions for accessing team or Microsoft 365 group data usually rely on these very, very broad permissions, such as group.read.all, which allows accessing all files, all conversations, everything attached to all groups in the organization. And so with Teams RSC, we can restrict that to just the data for a specific team, and it's the team in which the app was installed. For sites, we have a new capability, Sharepoint Site Collections. There's a new capability that allows an admin to consent to sites.selected, which is a restriction basically saying, hey, this app has access to specific individual sites. And then on SharePoint, using Microsoft Graph, can say, okay, now this application, I'm going to give it read permissions to one site and read write permissions to another site. And those are the only two sites that app will have access to. All of these flavors today that we've talked about are for direct access application, so limiting effectively similar to application permissions. Looking at time, I'm going to wrap up there. A few reminders is, as an app developer, always ask for least privilege permissions. Keep an eye on the Graph API, and once in a while, just check in to see if there's any new permissions, especially if some permission in particular is causing you heartache because you have to ask for it, or difficulty for your customers to actually grant access because it's more privileged than you actually need to. You just don't have any other option. We're constantly working on defining new permissions that are lesser privileged to allow more granularity there. And as an app customer, do keep in mind, if you see an application that's asking for more than you think it needs, dig into that, find out why, and often challenging the application publisher or developer, the result is, oh yeah, I was actually just testing and I finally found a combination that worked and I stopped there, and maybe there's something better than that. And on our side, we're working at Microsoft, we're working on some ways to better inform developers and customers on what the best combination is for the scenarios. Always prefer delegated access, so access on behalf of a user, over direct access if there's a user involved, right? So if there's a user involved, you don't want your application, which has been granted more access than the user, to be the reason the user was exposed to data they weren't supposed to see. And delegated access not only restricts the scope of access of your application, which is a good thing, it makes sure that the rules that are enforced include the authorization for whoever signed in. And then whenever you can, if you're doing a Teams app, if you're accessing SharePoint, always use these options to have lesser privilege and smaller scopes of access wherever possible. And you can expect that moving forward, there will be more opportunities for this. All right, in 1 minute I have left. Quick question. To access Teams admin console, a user is required to have the Teams communication support specialist role at least. Is there a way to grant this role to an app registration? Generally speaking, a role or authorization in general will not be given to an app registration. It will be given to the service principal. And I only make that distinction because if you ever try to do it through Graph or something, you won't want to assign a role to the application entity. You want to assign it to the service principal entity that maps to that application. So technically, it is possible to take any directory role and assign it to any service principal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the result will be what you expected. Ideally, it would. But today, there are some directory roles that don't work or are not recognized in some areas of Microsoft Graph and Microsoft 365 in general. Directionally, we want all of these roles to work for all of them. So it is possible to take the Teams communication support specialist, assign it to a service principal, so that application can then use the direct access flavor, get an app-only access token. The question then is, will this work and do what you're expected to do? And to answer that question, I'd have to know exactly what you're doing. And I probably still wouldn't be able to answer. We'd have to bring in my team's colleagues. But I'll definitely follow up to the person who asked that question. Right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think that's all for me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philippe. That was an excellent overview of app consent and really getting some of the nice details I'm sure a lot of people are having questions about. So thank you so much for that. You guys see a lot of applauses now in the
Thanks
in the bottom motions. So excellent. Thank you so much again for your time and really appreciate it. Next on our agenda, we're going to have Fabian Williams talking about considerations for creating an online meeting.
So everyone, thank you for jumping on the call today. In fact, a lot of what Philippe mentioned today actually plays well into the conversations that we're planning to have. One of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you all is because here at Microsoft, we hear from a lot of partners and customers some degree of confusion as to whether or not to use one of these methods of creating an online meeting over the other. Should they be using going to the Events API and using the calendar? Should they be using the cloud communications via Teams? So what I'd like to do today is actually clear up and speak to both of these first of all to ensure that we have a good understanding of what they're for, how they're used, and also when to use what, which is the reason why it's termed that way. So as part of the conversation when you're trying to create an online meeting, one of the options is the Calendar Events API. And what that will give you if you are creating such an object is to get instant visibility into your Microsoft Outlook calendar. So if this is important to you where you want to ensure that that online meeting that you're creating is visible inside that person's Outlook calendar, you get that. The ability to update and manage the online meeting experience in Outlook is another one. You'll see me talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the meeting lobby. And attendees may join in person or online or over the internet or via dial-in. So there's different modalities of how a person can join this meeting. And obviously, if they have the rich client features, if you're inside Microsoft Teams or if it's on Microsoft Outlook, these are areas where you can get the full enrich feature. So if you're looking at this in terms of what else can be done, or you, the app developer, are creating this from the API, there's a couple other things that you actually get as well too. You're able to inspect, using the allowed online meeting provider property to see what type of meetings that you can create. And you're also, let's say that you're targeting, the API endpoint / events, and you're looking to see what's there. If you look at the is online meeting, you can visually inspect that to see if it is an online meeting or not, and thereby convert something that was not an online meeting to an online meeting. You basically see that at the bottom right in terms of that screenshot being called out, / events / the event ID, and then setting that flag from what was previously false to true, and then also creating an online meeting provider. So, that's one approach there. To go into what Philippe mentioned before, there's a permission model set for this, and this one is pretty simple. It is basically calendar.read/write for both delegated and application permission. So, one set of permissions that's required, and it flows better or not you're doing direct access, as Philippe termed it, or if you're using delegated where you require that users consent. So pretty easy, to understand. The another scenario, if you're creating, an online meeting, is to basically use the online communications API, the cloud communications API. For this one, the real demarcation or the questions you're asking is that if you need a richer flexibility, if you need better integration into third-party applications, so the key question here, not directly tied to Microsoft Outlook. If you wanted to do this, for instance, if you had something inside a Google account, or if it's inside another application like a ServiceNow or something else, and you wanted to basically have an online meeting, then this is something that is given and granted to you. So basically, it is completely decoupled from Outlook Calendar, so it does not create an event for you. It also, one of the really cool things is that as we're working in a distributed fashion with people all over the country, all over the world, and people speak different languages other than English, you can actually create, as a part of that meeting experience, language-based information. So it comes up in the person's native language rather than in English or rather than something else. And one of the real cool features that I actually do like is the ability to spawn a meeting from a Microsoft chat. Pretty cool. Again, if you're doing this from the context of, looking at the API, there's things to call out. What else do you get for free? Video teleconferencing is done inherently through the video teleconference property. This one does require that you have the licenses for it as well. You see me call it out a little bit later on. And you're able to really manage attendees at a granular level in terms of, one of the ones being, whether this attendee, can bypass the lobby and other, security enablement that you can do around the user. So really, you can really, target that end user experience for that online meeting. And as I mentioned before, you can associate a meeting with an online chat. The one for here, though, to Philippe's point before, I heard a ton of stuff he was saying around the application access policy. You can see here that, for the delegated permission, you need online meetings.read-write. But for the application permission, it's online meeting.read-write at all, with a little asterisk there saying that, the administrator would need to basically create an app policy for your app in order to run in that modality. So if you're using app permission other than delegated permission, there's additional steps that are required. The docs clearly pointed out, and you'll see a link to that reference in my last screen. But here's one example that, that touched on something that Philippe mentioned before. So, as I was putting together this deck, and because, as I mentioned before, this is something that, the team here, the customer and partner experiences team that I'm a part of here all the time, these are questions that I get, or questions that I would sometimes post back. I think, as Philippe mentioned, you got to interrogate people as asking, why do you need this, or why does your app need that? So I typically would ask these questions, and I encourage you to ask yourself these questions in order to get the answer. So if one of you on the call here, come back to me later on, I will purposely pull this slide up. But quite simply, if you need to integrate, and I think some of these are like, if I were to quiz you at the end, you've already gotten some of the information before, but if you need to integrate with a calendar item, I think it's pretty clear. We talked about it before. If you need to go into Microsoft Outlook, what API would you be using? So read all of the stuff and look at the very bottom. You can clearly see it's the calendar API in order to do that, because the cloud API is fully decoupled. So pretty self-explanatory. I don't think there's anything else here that I wanted to touch on. I know you're reading the slide as I'm going. One of the things to call out, though, I did want to create a visual aid for you. The fact that it is tied directly to Outlook, this is exactly what that experience would be. So if you're in Outlook or OA and you click on the item, this is what you're going to see coming up. A little bit of a call out here. You see this little thing right here says meeting options. We'll get to that a little bit later on when I make that call out. But this is one of the examples where it's not something that's directly tied to the API, but if you wanted to manage the lobby per se, which is what this gives you, it does allow you to be able to do that manually. If you were to use the Cloud Communications API, as I mentioned before, you are then looking at a scenario where you are trying to integrate into other third-party experiences. So whether it's a third-party SaaS app, whether it's something inside like a Google, if you're inviting people from the outside and you want to be able to shove it there, then, if that is the case and you want to ensure the same consistent experience, whether or not the person has Outlook or not, but basically, throw that online meeting to somewhere where they're going to get it, then this is the job for you. And that's how it would basically manifest itself. This one here is an example of the control. Do you need to revert from an online meeting? And basically, so imagine a scenario if you had an online meeting and you wanted to basically go back from an online meeting to a non-online meeting, could you do that? The answer is notable. Another one is if you need language-based, and I think I touched on this before, do you need to manage language-based information? Then the answer is no if you're using a calendar API. But as I mentioned before, because the Cloud Communications API is very nuanced, it's very granular, you're able to do that. And you manage that experience by actually modifying one of the optional HTTP headers in order to be able to set, it's either EN for English, ES for Espanol, FR for French, and so on and so forth. If you are, and this is the other one now a little bit, it's unhidden, but do you need to join by internet, voice over IP, or by dial-up? That's what the question is being asked right here. And the answer is yes to both on this one, right? So whether or not you're using the Calendar API or the Cloud Communications API, you're able to join, by all these means. You can definitely see the conference ID and phone number. On the Calendar API, you're actually seeing the toll number and toll-free number on the Cloud Comm option as well, also with the ID that's provided. Do you need to integrate video conferencing audio or video capabilities? This one here, the one thing to call out is that it's certainly not supported inside the Events API. And you heard me mention before, somewhat in passing, that it is available in the Cloud Comms, but you do need to have a cloud video interrupt license user in order to see that, and basically have the ID inside there to basically have that video conference capabilities. The next one is, do you need to create an online meeting that refers to a chat? I think so. It's pretty much self-explanatory. If we're talking chat, we're talking Teams, right? Or we're talking, groups. We're definitely not talking calendar and events. So for this one, under the Calendar API, it is not supported. However, if you are doing this inside the Cloud Comms, as long as you have the chat ID, you can basically create a meeting surrounding the chat. So it has some context in terms of what you're going to be discussing. This one, do you need to manage a meeting inside the lobby? And that's the reason why I mentioned before that this one's a little bit tricky. It is unsupported in the Events API. However, if you were to create an online meeting using the Calendar Events API, it would have a link inside Microsoft Outlook for meeting options. And if you click on that link for meeting options, you will be able to affect changes there. If you are using the Cloud Comms API, I think I mentioned before also in the larger narrative where I said that you have very granular control over the end user experiences. So basically it is a property that you can affect, and you can really be really granular and nuanced with that. If you were to click the meeting lobby link inside Microsoft Outlook, for instance, this is the visual that you basically would get. These are some of the options that are available to you. Okay. So I believe I'm coming up on the last slide right now. This is basically just some resources for you. A lot of what I say right here, again, the reason for this is because depending on what you're searching for, especially if you don't know what you're searching for, sometimes it can be difficult to find it. Even sometimes if you know what you're searching for, because you may find it in essence, two different locations. If you're trying to create an online meeting, you may find it in Canada, you may find it in events. There's actually a good blog about choosing the API, one which I actually took a lot of this content from. I formulated it here in a more simpler asking a questions format. Some of these guidances are going to be here. And again, you'll get this link in my deck afterwards. But as you're doing all of these items as well, one of the things that I hear from our partners and customers also is around, hey, we're creating an app to do X, Y, and Z, and we're trying to spin up an online meeting, and it's going to be potentially thousands of people in attendees or hundreds of people in attendees, and we're doing this and we're having some issues. Understand as well that the throttling guidance does apply here as well. So be mindful of the terms of use, be mindful of the endpoints and the throttling guidance, and understand that throttling comes in several different flavors as well too. When you're working with the Microsoft Graph, your first API stop is basically the graph, and the graph itself has guidances. It has a lot of things for you. It helps you with, if you're using the SDK for one thing, it helps you with your 429, which is your throttling. So, I encourage you to use the SDK for that purpose. But if you're rolling it on your own as well, and you're hammering the API, you could get some 429s, and you need to handle that by the guidance that are here. However, there is, if you do a endpoint and you do a question mark, what if, behind it, it'll actually show you the backend API that we are also going against as well too, if you wanted to get a little bit more understanding of that. But I say that to say this, we are also calling the backend services, and the backend services may also have limits as well too. So I think just as Philippe mentioned before, there's an intersection that could happen around what we have in terms of our throttling guidance, but also the backend services as well as it relates to the Microsoft Graph. Because these have independent limits, I also called it out here. There's the Exchange Online limits that are here, and also the Cloud Comp limit that are here as well, too. So I think that's all I had for you, exactly. So open it up for any questions that you may have. Brian, I can give you back, 14 minutes?
Oh, we got a few minutes at the end for just open Q&A and then wrap up slides, but yep.
Right.
But while we're waiting for anyone to put anything into the chat window, or feel free to use the raise hand feature in Teams. Thank you, Fabian. Great content here. We do get a lot of questions on which API should I use or what are different scenarios. So great to cover this in a more broad detail.
Thank you.
See some nice claps and cheers and hands in the window. Thank you for sharing those, everyone.
Let me pose a question then to the audience. How many people here have created online meetings? And if so, which API did you target and what considerations were you thinking? I know that's a kind of open-ended question, but I like him that way. Allow me to learn from you as well. We have a bunch of people on this call. I'd love to hear your story. Anyone would like to share, or is this brand spanking new? No one's ever created an online meeting. Okay. Gabrielle is used and faced a couple of problems. Hopefully, Gabrielle, we cleared up some of those problems here today. Lane, you have a question?
Yes. Yeah, I'm looking to do an app with resources, exchange resources, which would be meeting rooms. How could I do that with Graph? I know how to access my own calendar, but does it mean the exchange meeting room has to get a email address to make it work, maybe? Because resources doesn't seem to be available on Graph.
Right. I'm not sure if meeting rooms is available. Do you know, Brian?
Yeah, so there's actually two ways that you can access like meeting rooms on Graph. We have a specific Places API. This is meant to treat a meeting room or other type of kind of resource as a first-class citizen. There's also a way to access it if you have, as you mentioned, like the email address for the meeting room. You can go through the Calendars API and be able to go and see things like scheduling or calendar view or similar types of things. So some of it will depend on what specifically you're doing. If it's just simply to add the room as an attendee, a resource to a meeting, there are APIs to go and do that so that when you do send the invite out, basically create the event, you can specify that location as this is what needs to be supplied in there. So do you have any details on what specifically you're trying to do?
Oh, I'm trying to do, someone is scheduling a meeting and he wants to choose the right available meeting room because there would be a calendar showing up of all the meeting rooms and he can choose for his time. You see what I mean? Or?
Yeah, I think the Places API would probably be the one to do because then you can query what's available. And then once you get that information back, then you would supply that in your meeting creation in order to book that room along with the meeting under that scenario.
Do you need to get a collection of users and meeting rooms to see what the schedule would be? Or is it just literally just for the meeting room itself?
No, it's just available or busy, so they can choose the right time.
Oops, yeah. Looks like Seb beat me to it. So there is actually, do you want to share, Seb, since you put it in there?
Yeah, so there's an actual API that allows you to get the busy free schedule from a resource, not just from a user, but also from an actual resource that you're going to get from the Places API. So that way you can actually put that logic in your app, and you're going to be able to do that.
Okay, I will check all this. Thank you.
Yes. And then one other thing just to share, the one that Seb mentioned is the free busy API. There's also a find meeting times API. And there's a slight difference between what gets returned for each one. So one is, give me a set of just like available options. The other one is, find the open times, and then you can kind of work out which one that you want to schedule for. So, and we've actually got a separate document that tells you, well, which should I use when? Because there is kind of that the difference in what's the return on that.
And an extension to that would be to have a virtual agent to do that. You can say, I want a meeting at this time, and it would show you the bot would show you the available rooms. Maybe I will do that in the future.
Yes, so the bot framework would be very helpful there.
Yeah, Teams, yeah, would be great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Great question.
Right, and we have about 2 minutes left. If anyone else has any additional questions, we'll kind of open the floor for open questions or other things that you'd like to share.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear somebody.
Yeah, okay. I would like to know if you plan to open Graph API to be able to run Custo queries like your Premier support can do, because so far I'm asking because we are owner of our own data, obviously, and not being able to even query against them because of limited or buggy or data filtering is sometimes painful.
What type of data are you looking to query for? Is this data in Microsoft 365, in Azure? What's
Intune.
the Intune data? I'm not sure if we have any experts on Intune on the line.
Overall, or IAD devices, let's say so, to keep things simple.
The short answer is probably not. That is not to say that we don't want to offer more options and equivalent query capabilities through Graph. And in some cases, it certainly will make sense to offer options to put it into Custo or something you can query with Custo, not Custo itself, or Azure Data Explorer. But I think we'll first make sure that we understand what limitations you have in terms of querying, and then make sure that you're able to query them through Graph or through other interface, whatever makes most sense. Yeah.
We reported countless time problems with dollar filter is and with or contains and stuff like or similar or data. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Almost everything that's in the directory, including, for example, a list of devices, as I'm sure you know, almost everything has very limited string search capabilities, and that just has to do with how it was originally built and is currently still stored under the covers. So since then, we've actually added some capabilities, I'm sure you're familiar with them, that allow full text search for some object types. So for example, application and I think service principal and some end users, we actually allow you to use search instead of dollar filter and stuff like that. And so there are more options there, but
search
it still
doesn't work on Intune. Anything Intune related, that's the problem.
Right, and so for some things you will see those coming up, but what's most important here is that we know what are the ones that you're trying to do, which ones you would expect or want to be able to do, so we can make sure that feedback is communicated to, for example, the Intune folks if it turns out to be an Intune API.
Just a really quick thing, since you guys are on that, within that same vein, I guess what would be helpful to me too is understanding what filter parameters are actually accepted for any given endpoint, because sometimes it's hard to tell. Like sometimes the messages that come back will let you know, other times, my experience, that isn't always the case. So it's like, it's kind of annoying. And sometimes what's supported there plays into a design, right? Like if filtering is not available server side, then you need to account for that other ways, which can cause downstream delay and blah, 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 right? So like, it's just really frustrating going through all the different endpoints on Graph and not understanding what filter is supported and where.
Yeah, that is something that we've heard a few times before, and we have some, at least what I've seen, and other folks may have some additional details, but I've seen a few examples, different choices we have right now. We're choosing between for how just to express this in the documentation, right? Today, in theory, internally at Microsoft, everyone who owns an API will go and make sure, hey, this property supports these filters. But there are a few problems with that. First of all, it's unstructured, so we can't easily take that and, for example, make sure it's easily included as part of our auto-generated documentation or taken into account as part of the SDKs. Or things like Graph Explorer that will help you identify this. The second problem is we would rely on humans to be updating that and that to be accurate, which is not always the best approach. So one of the things we're working on is taking it actually even earlier and making it part of the API description, so dollar metadata, using that to feed the documentation so that you'll have a table for every API that says, for this property, these filters are supported, these ones are not. And hopefully that will solve the discovery problem. How do I learn which ones work, which ones don't work, or which ones are expected to work and which ones not? The other problem we'll still have there, though, is there'll be lots which are not supported that you might want supported. And so for there, we really rely on your feedback so that we know which ones to prioritize. So long story short, you should expect in the coming, let's say, weeks, but maybe months, a much better experience for learning which filters work, which ones don't. And please let us know when there are which filters you would have wanted to use but did not find available.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Philippe. Good information. And if anyone is interested, we do have a location where you can submit things like feature requests, suggestions, other things related to Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Graph specifically, aka.ms/m365dev. graph-suggestions. Feel free to fill out things there or upvote additional ones that are already out there. And with we have 1 minute left, I'll just go quickly through the last slides on here. Quick call out, if you're interested in joining the Microsoft Graph TAP, this is our technology adoption preview program. We offer a monthly call with this, as well as some additional benefits for this. Feel free to submit the form at aka.ms/graph-tap-form. We also have a number of different Microsoft 365 developer community calls, ourselves, Depth Cards, Identity Teams, Offset, and Power Apps, Sharepoint, and more. Feel free to take a look at the link at the very bottom, aka.ms/m365dev calls. You can get a listing of all the different calls out there, as well as links to go and join with those. I'll call it to our Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast run by Jeremy Thwaites and Paul Schaeflein. Great way to keep up to date on what is happening in the Microsoft 365 developer ecosystem, news, announcements, other types of solutions that are being shared out. Also, the Microsoft Graph Mailbag. This is a bi-monthly posting where we share out different kind of lessons learned, different samples of things related to Microsoft Graph. You can find this at aka.ms/msgraphmailbag. And a big thank you to everyone for joining in today, sharing any of your questions, your applause, your feedback, all very, very welcome. You can find the recording for today's session. Will be out on the Microsoft 365 Developer YouTube channel. That'll be posted once it is available. And a note for our next call will be on June 1st at 8 a.m. Pacific time as well. You can find the link for joining in, aka.ms/MicrosoftGraphCall. So a big thank you everyone to joining in today again. Thank you for your time and attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Cheers.